Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Just being with you last week. We had a mission Sunday I had to do some stuff for, which was really good. But I love being back here. It's a beautiful day out, isn't it? Yeah, sunshine and 60 degrees, blue skies, and just feeling like a crisp fall day. I love that, especially after all that rain. We're going to be in Mark chapter 11. We're starting to transition in our story here, some key scenes as we get toward the end. But I want to start reflecting on something we kind of talked a little bit about several weeks ago, but thinking about children. When you look at a baby, and we've got one in our midst, right? It's just amazing, because whenever you look at a baby, especially an infant, and you begin to wonder about what they might become, because life stretches before them with this kind of endless possibilities, and you don't know. I mean, it could be we have a major league star among us. You never know. Life's just new, and it's full of everything that is before us. And even young children, young children, typically they're not afraid of new things. And so they're willing to try some things that maybe as we get older, we're a little bit more hesitant about. I find the older I get, the more I'm like, I don't know if that's the wisest thing to do. I try not to avoid those things, but they haven't figured out what they like and what they don't like yet. They haven't really made all those decisions. They're not sure what they're good at or what they're not so good at, and so they just try stuff. But as we grow older, we learn more about ourselves, and we begin to make choices. We begin to choose certain paths over others, and our personalities and our habits and our practices become more entrenched. And you begin to have a sense of who you are, and we create a narrative. And all of that, in many ways, is healthy and good, depending on the kind of narrative that you have for yourself. Sometimes that narrative, however, can get unhealthy because perhaps we've taken a wrong path. And we begin to think that is the only kind of narrative there is about us. But narratives are good. So we all are different, right? Some people love spending an afternoon in an art museum. Others maybe in a tree stand. Some love, high fashion. Others like torn blue jeans. It all depends. That's what makes life interesting and different. But it's when those narratives become kind of negative and entrenched. When perhaps you follow a path and you think that's the only path you can follow, and you get caught up in routines. Sometimes we figure things out about ourselves and we think that's all there is to it. And we start living that particular story and we get stuck in that. And routines, of course, can be helpful. They help us to kind of stay on track and those kinds of things. But they also can cause us to forget about other possibilities for our lives. That we end up just doing the things that we've always done, and we just keep following that same routine. And at that point, we're no longer really living our lives. We're simply watching life pass by. And this can be true of religion as well. This thing that is meant to be intensely personal and a soul-reviving experience can become merely a habit. It can become something that, it's a good habit, but it can become something that we just do out of routine. And our faith becomes reduced to this kind of collection of actions, like praying before a meal, or coming to church on Sunday, or reading my Bible before I go to bed. Those are all good things, but it becomes simply something I do. Actions the body performs without much thought, without the heart truly being involved. And so this morning we're going to see Jesus kind of attacking that kind of solidified faith, that institutionalized faith. And so the text this morning actually has two parts. We're going to talk first about what's popularly called the triumphal entry. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to move on to what we call the cleansing of the temple. But we'll spend a brief moment here with this first story. This is one we typically reserve for Palm Sunday, but we're going to do it because it's right here in our story in Mark, the triumphal entry. So Jesus, if you might remember, has spent most of his time in ministry up in Galilee. That's where he was born, that was where he was raised, and that's where he's ministered. And he's been traveling down to Jerusalem, and along the way he's been gathering folks. And so he's coming now to Jerusalem for his final time on earth, right before his crucifixion. And he's accompanied by this throng of people as he approaches the city. And these people are not citizens from Jerusalem, there are actually two groups. One group is the followers of Jesus. We've got peasants and farmers. We have tax collectors and sinners. We have all kinds of folks that are following Jesus, and they have been from Galilee. But as they approach Jerusalem, they're also going to be joined by other pilgrims because it's Passover. But as they come, Jesus' followers have high expectations. Right? They've seen miraculous things. They've seen the blind receiving sight. They've seen the lame walking. They even saw a dead girl raised from the dead. And so they're very, very excited because they have now figured out that Jesus is more than a rabbi. He's even more than a prophet. They've come to the conclusion that Jesus is perhaps the Messiah they've long expected. And Jesus has talked about the kingdom of God. And they've been expecting the kingdom of God, and they think as they approach Jerusalem that now is the time when this might finally be realized. As they approach Jerusalem, they see the throng of people coming together. You see, Jerusalem was probably about 30,000 folks during the normal part of the year, but during the festival season, especially during Passover, there would be probably about 180,000 people in this city. And so every room is going to be filled, and even the hillside will be full of people camping out for this special festival. And so the disciples are thinking, this is a great opportunity to crown Jesus as king and raise an army. And so they're ready and they're anticipating. But the problem they've had is that Jesus has never publicly proclaimed himself as Messiah. I mean, the disciples figured it out, but he's never preached that. And then as they approach the village of Bethany on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, Jesus stops the procession. And he instructs two of his disciples to go and get a mule and bring it for him to ride on, a donkey. And it seems a bit odd from an outsider's perspective when you think about this, because Bethany is just over the valley across the Mount of Olives, about 2 miles from Jerusalem. And you're thinking, wait a minute, Jesus has just walked all the way from Galilee down to Jerusalem, and now he can't make it 2 more miles on foot. He's got to call a donkey because he's too tired? I don't think so. Right? I think something more is going on, and so did his disciples. They recognize that Jesus, through this action of riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, is actually making a proclamation, an open proclamation of his messiahship, because there's echoes here. There's echoes of Old Testament scriptures. The first one we want to look at is 1 Kings chapter 1. What you see here is an alien being took over my mother. And there's this tremendously angry and cranky woman there. We got lost on the way to Mount Vernon, and then it just, it went downhill from there. It was not a pretty sight. And so you begin to wonder, is this kind of like what's going on with Jesus? Is he like, I didn't get my breakfast, and I'm really upset about it. I'm just going to curse this fig tree. It doesn't seem to be exactly what's going on. And especially when Mark notes for us that Jesus found nothing on the fig tree, for it was not the season for figs. And then you're like, wait a minute. Why is Jesus cursing a fig tree that wasn't supposed to have figs anyway? Because it's not the season for figs. Is something else perhaps going on here? But we'll come back to that a little bit later. So he comes into Jerusalem the second time, and he goes to the temple, and what he finds there, of course, are people buying and selling animals, and he's got some money changers there, and all this is standard practice for the temple. You see, Jesus has come at the time of Passover, and about 2 weeks before Passover, they started collecting the annual temple tax. Every Jew had to pay a certain amount of money every year to support the temple. And depending on where you were from, of course, you couldn't use Roman coinage to do this because it was not appropriate. It had images and all kinds of stuff. And so they had money changers there set up so that when you came, you could exchange your foreign coinage for the Tyrian shekel, and that would be appropriate to pay. And there was a little surcharge, of course, on there, so they could make a little bit of money off of that. And then there were, of course, animals that needed to be sacrificed. And here we have, in the temple structure,
this idea that you had to come in and sacrifice an unblemished animals, and so they had animals there provided for people. If an animal was not good enough, the priestly inspector said this has a blemish on it, then you could go to their table and buy a lamb, right? So Jesus has a problem with what he sees going on, perhaps because specifically of where it's going on. And Jesus begins to make a scene. He's in prophet mode again, and he starts overturning the tables and driving out those who are buying and selling, and overturning the tables of the money changers and so forth. And all of this is taking place in the court of the Gentiles. And so we have a little diagram up there to help you figure this out, where all this would be. So we need to remember that the temple structure is made up of several different courtyards. The court of Israel, which was in the inner sanctuary, that's where the sacrifice would actually take place, was only open to Jewish men. The outer court in front of that is the court of women. Jewish women could go into that particular space. And then the far larger courtyards on the outside, anybody could go there, the Gentiles as well, both men and women. And so it would be in those outer courtyards where this took place. And by the way, that is a really, really large space. And so whatever Jesus did would not have been particularly noticed by everyone because the space was so large. So if you're on the other side of the temple, you don't even know this is happening. But you can be sure that the temple authorities knew exactly what was taking place. And it is, in fact, most likely because of this action, cleansing of the temple, that Jesus is eventually arrested and crucified. This is kind of the break moment for him. But why is Jesus so upset? Listen to his own words, verse 17. And as he taught them, he said, "Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." Now, there are two potential criticisms as we think about why Jesus does what he does. One is this last phrase, den of robbers. And this has led some to speculate that there were perhaps some suspicious business practices going on. So everybody had to sacrifice, and some people chose to bring their own animals from wherever they're traveling from. So say you're going to bring your Passover lamb from home, and you get to the temple, and there's a priestly inspector there that has to examine your animal to make sure that it's appropriate for sacrifice. It has to be unblemished. And the priestly inspector says, you know, this animal doesn't pass muster. I'm sorry, you will not be able to sacrifice this animal, but you're in luck because over here for $19.99 we have sheep available to be bought, and so you have to buy one from them. And perhaps at a higher charge than is the going rate, and so forth. So we're not sure exactly if any of that was happening, but some have suggested that perhaps some those kinds of business practices were going on. But the first criticism seems fairly clear. My house will become a house of prayer for all nations. You see, the temple was supposed to be a temple for all peoples. If we go all the way back to when Solomon first dedicated the temple, this is what he says as part of his prayer, 1 Kings chapter 8. As for the foreigners who do not belong to your people, this again is Solomon praying this, who do not belong to your people Israel, but have come from a distant land because of your name, for they will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm. When they come and pray toward this temple, then hear from heaven your dwelling place. Do whatever the foreigners ask you, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your own people Israel, and may know that this house I have built bears your name. But see, the only part of the temple that the Gentiles, the people of all nations, could do that, the foreigners could do that, was in the court of the Gentiles. This very space that has now become a place of commerce. As if the Jews didn't expect the Gentiles to be there, trying to worship. And so one of the clear criticisms seems to be, you have lost the vision of God that is for all nations, and you focus only on yourselves. But there's one other criticism we can find. Let's not miss this. So let's finish the story. Jesus leaves after these events. He goes home out to the hillside. He's evidently camping on the Mount of Olives, as are a lot of the pilgrims those days. And he camps outside the city, comes back in during the morning, and lo and behold, his disciples see the fig tree. And it's withered to its roots. The fig tree he cursed the previous day. And now we can begin to understand the purpose of the fig tree. For you see, Mark is using, as he tells this story, a very common narrative structure in his gospel. It's called, to use a large word, intercalation. Wow, that's a fancy one. And what that simply means is that Mark will often do this where he starts one story, he tells another story, and then he ends the first story. And the story on the outside, the bracketing story, is meant for us to interpret the inner story, that they're connected in some way. And Mark has done this intentionally so that we can use the fig tree story and understand it against the cleansing of the temple. Now, why am I saying that Mark's done this? Well, if you look over at Matthew tells the order of the story differently. Right? In Matthew's story, the fig tree is completely separate from the cleansing of the temple. It all happens at once. You can go check that later. So this seems to be an intentional move on Mark's part, and we see it all over his gospel. He does it time and time again. So let's start recognizing that this fig tree is not about the cranky Jesus, but this is a prophetic sign. That when Jesus came to the fig tree, he saw a tree that outwardly had all the signs of being healthy and productive. It had green leaves, but it was fruitless. And because of that, it was doomed to pass away. So too, when Jesus comes to the temple, he's looking for fruit of righteousness, and compassion, and mercy, and heart submitted to God. But what he finds instead is this very well-run and efficient institution. He finds a polished religion that has gotten the process of sacrifice down to a science. But the fruit that God is looking for is missing. And so the fig tree becomes a symbol, because you see, just like the fig tree, so too this temple will be destroyed. And Jesus will make this very clear a couple chapters later when he prophesies the destruction of the temple. And that will become a reality in 70 AD. But Jesus is using the fig tree as a symbol of that now. You see, the Jewish faith has become an institution desperately in need of reform. An institution that lacks the concern for all the nations around it, that lack the heart of God. And so Jesus is condemning it. And so what's the message for us? How does this relate to us? I mean, after all, we're not involved in sacrifice in any way. We don't have a temple religion. But I think what we see here is a warning. You see, it's a natural pattern of any movement to lose energy and vibrancy over time. And the early church started with lots of energy and passion. The earliest Christians believed that Jesus was coming back very, very soon, and they went to great lengths to spread that message throughout the earth. And they paid a great price, some even with their very lives, to let the world know about God and His love for them. Yet as the centuries passed, things began to change, and especially with the time of Constantine, the religion became more formal and settled in and settled down to a professional kind of style. They built churches that reached to the heavens. They had professional priesthood. They had a doctrine that was set and established, and everything was running smoothly. Yet somehow in the midst of this institutionalization, the heart of the faith was lost, and the routine and ritual took over. And they turned inward, and they lost their sense of mission. Now, over the centuries, there's been a variety of reform movements that seek to recapture that early spirit, to reclaim what Jesus initially taught and preached about. But what always happens is that after the first generation, once you get into the second and then the third generation, people always tend to get comfortable. they settle down and they settle in. And they start living according to the routines that have been developed. And that's the danger that we have to be aware of. That we can become very good at performing worship. That the rituals and the routines can become comfortable. And that we can become like a fig tree with no fruit. Because the fruit just dries up and withers. And there's nothing left on the vine. When God looks at us, what does He see? You see, when there's such a great disparity between what we look like on Sunday and how our lives are lived on Monday, we know the plant is in trouble. When God looks at us, will He find fruit? Or will He find a barren plant? You know, you have to work to maintain a relationship. And this is true of whether it be a marriage or a friendship or any kind of relationship. It takes energy. It takes effort. And if you settle in too much, like an old married couple that is into their routines and they just keep doing the same things over and over again, the relationship can wither and grow stale. And the same is true of our relationship with God. If we don't infuse it with energy and effort, it can become a barren plant. So when God looks at us, what does He see? We have to maintain that relationship. We need to seek a vibrancy. We have to make sure that we're not becoming insular. But we have to recognize the needs of those around us. We have to start creating spaces in our churches, in our lives, in our hearts for the outsiders. And recognize the way God sees them. I'll invite the praise team to come out as we finish this. I think what we need to do is become more open to the leading of God. In every facet of our life, we can allow the routine to become who we are. But God might want something different for us. And if we just follow the routine, we'll never know it. So I would ask you to think this morning, what habits and thoughts and practices have you allowed to creep into your life that dishonor God, that take away from true worship? Maybe it's time to do a little cleansing of our own and to root out the parts of our lives that have become old and stale, and to renew our relationship again, and to find fruit on our trees. Let's worship together.